Hello, today is Friday, January 15th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Beginning this year, new federal regulations take effect that require companies to transmit accurate location information with each 911 call originating from company premises. As early as next year, variations of that requirement will be extended to any 911 call originating on enterprise infrastructure, regardless of the caller's physical location. These new requirements are in addition to rules that took effect last year and that we covered in a podcast that mandate companies ensure 911 calls are delivered directly to public safety answering points, and also provide internal notification that a 911 call had been made. And if all that weren't enough, companies still have to comply with rules and regulations in over 20 states that relate to 911 calls originating from businesses. This is a big deal. So let's discuss it with Andrew Brown, the managing partner at LB3 and the chairman of TC2. Andrew is a subject matter expert on 911 issues, particularly as they relate to obligations imposed on businesses. Hey, Andrew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Joe. Happy New Year. Looks like we are back at this.
Yeah, Happy New Year. It's almost exactly a year to the day that we last talked about E911 regulations for business. And at that time, the federal rules had just been adopted, but now they're starting to take effect. And I know that you've been fielding a lot of anxious inquiries from our clients about what the rules require and what the compliance deadlines are.
Yeah, the rubber is definitely starting to hit the road on E911 obligations. And businesses that have either put off dealing with this issue or have dealt with it on a kind of piecemeal basis really have to get their act together and develop a roadmap on how to deal with their 911 calling situation across a bunch of different scenarios for their end users and their enterprise infrastructure.
You know, when we talked about this last year, you mentioned how complicated this is getting for companies because of changes in the workplace, greater mobility in the end user population, of course, the rapidly evolving technologies and communications infrastructure. It would be great if you could review that, but do you want to first just give a quick rundown on what the new obligations are and what problem they're trying to address?
Sure, it's pretty familiar ground at this point. The new federal rules try to solve basically two problems that can often arise when someone calls 911 from a business location. The first is about access. When someone dials 911 from your business, what happens? The federal rules that address this issue, you might have heard of them by the name Carey's Law, require that businesses program their infrastructure so that an end user can access 911 by dialing the digits 911. No prefixes, no alternative dialing patterns, just the digits 911. And you also have to make sure that the call is delivered to local emergency services, no redirecting it to a security desk on site or some other internal answering point. And last, you have to make sure that there is an internal, what's called a contemporaneous notification that a 911 call has been made. Here's where the security desk or some other point of contact gets notified that there's an emergency situation and that fire, medics, police, whatever, might be arriving at the location.
Now, just to show you that I've been listening, Andrew, all these years that you've been advising on E911, I believe the second problem the rules address is sending caller location information.
Yes, that's correct. So it's always been pretty basic that when you call 911 from your home, your street address gets sent to 911, and that works pretty well for delivering emergency services in that scenario. But location information has always presented a problem for business locations, which are bigger, and they often have multiple floors or really big workspaces. They can have a single PBX that serves multiple buildings. And now, of course, much of the infrastructure is cloud-based, so people can remote in and create virtual presences from locations nowhere near their so-called business address. So getting to the basic idea that the actual location information of the caller, not the virtualized location that they create, is what gets transmitted with each 911 call. And that can be technically challenging.
So what do the federal rules require, and do they make any accommodation for the technical complexity that you just described?
Yeah, so the federal rules, which are often referred to by their catchy legislative name, the Ray-Bombs Act, they require that businesses transmit what's called quote unquote dispatchable location with each call. And dispatchable location is defined as, and I'm going to just read it here. First, the caller's street address. And second, additional information such as a suite or apartment that is necessary to identify the location of the calling party. So there's a huge subjective component which businesses need to determine based on what their premises actually look like. If it's multi-floor, then transmitting a floor would be helpful. If it's a huge workspace with cubicles, then maybe a subnet or quadrant identifier of some kind, such as east side or north wing, based on like square footage, that would be called for.
Now, that all sounds useful when people were actually working in their offices.
Yeah, I mean, that raises another huge issue when companies start to dig into this. So, obviously, work from home has created some challenges for transmission of accurate location information because employees may be logged in all day on a virtual desktop or whatever, and it hits to the core of both of these problems, whether they can first access 911 at all when using something like Teams or Zoom as a client, or what location information can and is transmitted, and then what employers actually tell their employees about this. Sometimes disclaimers are called for and instructions to employees to maintain an alternative means to access 911 from their homes and actually use those alternative means if there's an emergency is really important to address the risk issues associated with this.
So, a bit more complicated than we can definitively cover on this podcast for sure. But I do want to ask about the deadlines and any exceptions that may exist.
Yeah, the compliance deadline for the Carey's Law access requirements was January 16th, 2020, so about a year ago. The compliance deadlines for Ray Baum's location requirements started on January 6th, 2021 for what are called on-site fixed devices, so like hard phones that sit on a desk. The rules extend to both on-prem and off-prem mobile devices like tablets and soft phones on laptops. And there are a few variations on the requirements, and those deadlines kick in on January 6th, 2022. But here's the good news. These rules technically only apply to communications infrastructure that's installed after February of 2020. So there's a grandfathering for legacy equipment that was installed before that time. And the only caveat to that is if there's a significant or substantial upgrade in the hardware or software to that legacy infrastructure, making compliance with these rules technically feasible, then that may constitute a new installation and then the rules would apply according to the deadlines.
Hey, I noticed at the start of that, you said that they technically only apply after January 6th, 2021.
Well, it is a safe harbor to minimize forced or costly upgrades on legacy equipment, but it's untested. And the reality is that most enterprise infrastructure gets upgraded somewhat regularly anyway, and it may be capable of complying with these obligations when that upgrade occurs. More importantly, these rules really do just lay out best practices that businesses should be moving toward achieving to protect their employees and provide a safe workplace, and in the process, limit their liability for things that might go wrong. One thing you shouldn't be swayed by, though, is the vendor of E911 software telling you that the law requires you to buy their product. It doesn't, even if it reminds us of that universal truth that when a telecom or software vendor starts explaining your legal obligations, they're almost certainly wrong. So get a second opinion on that.
Andrew, as a wrap up, how do you advise clients to get started? I mean, what's the typical scenario when they reach out to you for guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that companies need to understand is that this process, unfortunately, is not quick or simple. There isn't just one list of rules you can go to and say you're in compliance with the federal rules and the rules of all the states that have 911 regulations. So you kind of have to be prepared for this to be an actual project where you look at what your technology plans are generally, what the technical capabilities are and are going to be, and what your many different kinds of facilities look like. Then you have to really start laying out your employee use cases. And there are a lot of them now. Do you have a lot of people in urban office towers or suburban campuses? Do you have a large remote or work from home population? Do you have call centers? And are any of those remote call centers? It's not easy because you may have a combination of all of those things. So you can't just ask what are the 5 rules my company has to comply with. There are too many judgment calls you need to make based on your company's premises, its approach to risk management, and the various stakeholders, which can involve groups as diverse as IT, HR, real estate, and facilities. There are unique use cases in each organization, as we discussed. So you need to develop an E911 roadmap based on the requirements of the rules and your technology roadmap. And then when you come up with plans for each use case, you have to test those against what the obligations require.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. As you just heard, this is a big deal for enterprises, and you probably need to take some action. So if you'd like to talk to Andrew about your E911 requirements, please give him a call or send him an email. You can also contact Andrew, me, or any of our colleagues at LB3 and TC2 about your other ICT needs. And then finally, if you want to stay up to date on the goings on in the ICT space, please subscribe to our Staying Connected podcast, check out our websites, and follow us on LinkedIn.